So now we are going to do number 9. This is the branches and tributaries of Hinduism. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these other types of Hinduism, exactly what they're about, and we'll see how this goes. We're going to talk about, again, we'll have another Gita excerpt, and then we're going to talk about the 4 basic branches we have already to some extent. Then we're going to talk about the almost Hinduism, and we'll touch a little bit on the 6, or in Sanskrit, sad darshanas, the various kinds of views. And then we have 4 Sampradayas. All right, so here is our verse, and this is a segment of verses. This is from 12th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the very first verse, and we're going to go about 4 or 5 verses deep into the 12th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna asks a question at this part of Bhagavad Gita. He asks, which are considered to be more perfect, those who are always properly engaged in your devotional service, or those who worship the impersonal Brahman, the unmanifested? In the last session, we talked about this idea of the impersonal Brahman. So Arjuna is asking the question point blank to Krishna at this point. Now, which is better, to worship this Brahman or to worship you in devotional service? So this is the question. And here's how Krishna answers it. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, those who fix their mind on my personal form and are always engaged in worshiping me with great and transcendental faith are considered by me to be the most perfect. So Arjuna asks a simple question. Krishna gives him a simple answer. Arjuna is asking which is better, to worship the Brahman or to worship his personal form. Krishna says, fix your mind on my personal form, engaged in worshiping me. They're considered most perfect. However, Krishna does expand a little further here. He says, but those who fully worship the unmanifested, that which lies beyond the perception of senses, the all-pervading, inconceivable, unchanging, fixed and immovable, the impersonal conception of the absolute truth, by controlling various senses, being equally disposed to everyone, such persons engaged in the welfare of all at last achieve me. So this also can get you there. However, there is a caveat here. For those whose mind are attached to the unmanifested impersonal feature of the Supreme, advancement is very troublesome. To make progress in that discipline is always difficult for those who are embodied. So, for those who try to present the spin on the Bhagavad Gita that it's about not Krishna, but the unborn within Krishna, for those who are trying to explain this concept that really Krishna is just one condensation of the limitless effulgence, and therefore it's the limitless effulgence which is the key thing. For those people who have this view, Krishna is here explaining the opposite thing, and this is right in Bhagavad Gita. So if we take Bhagavad Gita at its word, what it's saying, then we immediately understand what the Bhagavad Gita's take is on it. Questions about that? So if there is a contest between which interpretation to understand about the Bhagavad Gita, then we should take the Bhagavad Gita's own testimonial as final. And in this case, all we have to learn is that there's an impersonal feature. Krishna agrees it exists. And he says people who follow that path at last achieve me. But he says that klesho, this process, is very difficult. Why is it difficult? Because we are persons. It's hard for us to relate to non-persons. I mean, if you were going to have a relationship with this fuzzy all-pervading effulgence, how would you have a relationship with it exactly? It's not something we can grasp. It's not something that comes natural, normal, or easy for us. So this is the verdict of Bhagavad Gita. So we are, little by little, kind of recognizing what Bhagavad Gita does say and what it doesn't say. What we mean by Bhagavad Gita as it is. People who have another view will try to walk around or talk around these verses, but they are painting a different direction for the Bhagavad Gita than the Bhagavad Gita paints for itself. So these are the four main branches of Hinduism: Vaiṣṇavism, Shaivism, Shaktism, Advaita, Vedanta. We spoke about those a minute ago. That Vaiṣṇavism worships the Supreme as Vishnu or Krishna. The purpose is to serve Krishna without motivation and without interruption. We are not worshiping God so that God will turn around and fulfill our Christmas list of things we want. We are worshiping God because that's what life is for. And by worshiping God, we become genuinely happy as a fringe benefit, as a side effect. We're not worshiping to gain material happiness, or much less are we worshiping God with the idea of specific material benedictions we're hoping to achieve. We're worshiping God for its own sake. So that's Vaiṣṇavism. Shaivism is worshiping Shiva. And in Shaivism, Shiva is considered the supreme being. And in Shaivism, the idea is to worship Shiva as the supreme. But we find that in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna claims that he's the supreme. He doesn't claim that Shiva is the supreme. And there are a lot of different, cultures associated with Shaivism. And generally speaking, I won't get into that here very much. We have Shaktism, or Shakta worship, which is worshiping Shiva's wife, Durga Devi. Many people do this. In fact, in Bengal, mostly people worship Durga and Vishnu. They kind of worship both. They worship Krishna and Durga. They figure they get the best of both worlds. They are worshiping Krishna because they've heard that's the highest thing. But why ignore Durga Devi? Because we can get our material desires fulfilled. So Krishna explains in Bhagavad Gita that those who approach demigods are actually really only approaching him, but they do so in a wrong way. And Krishna talks about the fact that these are the materially motivated ways of trying to get at the purpose of life. So if one is still convinced that material life is so that we can become materially happy, then these other things are fine. We will worship various demigods. We worship Durga Devi, we worship Shiva, or anything. We can even want material happiness and worship Vishnu or Krishna, which is better than worshiping the demigods, because Krishna will or will not fulfill the material desire. But if he does fulfill it, it won't be in such a way that it will cause us to continue in the cycle of birth and death. So if one is worshiping a demigod for material benediction, then one will want to continue to worship that demigod so that same material benediction is current, it stays fulfilled. Finally, we have Advaita Vedanta, which we've been talking about. This is the impersonal effulgence, the white light. So some people want to merge with the white light. We talked a little bit about why that's not a good idea. and why we can't remain there even if we manage to make it there. It's very difficult, by the way, to purify oneself to the extent it would take to be able to merge into the white light. It's very difficult to do that. But if you do that, you will eventually find that you are unsatisfied there and you have to come back out to the everyday world. And Prabhupada says mostly people who try for merging with the white light, they come back out and they start hospitals and political parties and things like that. They do some kind of welfare work. Questions about?
Yeah. Prabhuji, you said that Krishna is supreme, that's fine. But at the same time, Krishna also worshipped Shiva, Lord Shiva, in Krishna avatar, as well as in Rama avatar also he worshipped Lord Shiva. I mean, what does that interpretation?
Well, Krishna did that. What's interesting, and we talked about that last week, that there are the important aspects of the Vedas, but then there is the sort of next door stuff. If someone has a problem with giving everything to the Supreme Lord, if someone doesn't want bhakti, then there are other processes where they can try to fulfill their material desires, but they will do so in not a very ugly and brutal way. You know, they'll try to do that in a nice way. So there are other demigods, and we find that Krishna, or in Krishna Lila, we have the story of Govardhan Hill, where Nanda Baba is getting ready to perform a puja for Indra. Why does he do that? They're agriculturalists. So Nanda Maharaj is engaging in activities that are agricultural, so he needs rain. And so therefore, farmers, they worship Indra, and Indra sends the rain. So he's doing it. And Krishna is asking his father, why are you doing this, Baba? Why are you worshiping Indra? Is this a traditional thing? And when Nanda Maharaj explains to his young son, why they're worshiping, Krishna poo-poos it. And he says that we should just worship Govardhan Hill. And Nanda Maharaj doesn't exactly appreciate that. He doesn't, he says, well, we'll do both. We'll do this Indra Puja now, and then later on we'll do this Govardhan Puja that you're talking about. So he makes this concession, sort of bargaining with little Krishna. And Krishna says, no, there's no time. We have to do the Govardhan Puja now. So Krishna kind of pushes Nanda Maharaj. Even though he's this young boy, he's still very impactful in the way he speaks, and he's very impressive in what he says and how he says it. So his father is somehow persuaded to follow his young son's advice, and he gives up the idea of doing Indra Puja. And sure enough, after giving up that and worshipping Govardhan Hill, Indra is angry. And Indra sends monsoon rains to destroy Vrindavan. And so his father's thinking, well, I did this on your advice, and now look what's happening. And Krishna says, that's all right. And then he, lifts up Govardhan Hill and he saves all of them. And then Indra finally realizes that Indra is out of line. And Indra comes and begs forgiveness for Krishna. So for people who are not interested in bhakti, the Vedas have all these other prescriptions: worship demigods, perform various sacrifices, have pujas, engage in austerities, do fasting, don't speak. All these various kinds of possibilities are there. And but for one who has already come to the stage of engaging in bhakti yoga, there is no necessity whatsoever to go back and to try to, follow, or there's no purpose in needing to worship other demigods or any of this other thing. So there is a verse, Devarshi Bhutapta Ninam Pitrinam Na Kinkaro Nayam Rinicha Rajan Sarva Manoya Sharnam Saranyam Gato Mukunda Paritya Kartam. That one who is engaged in serving Mukunda, the giver of liberation, owes neither duties or obligations to demigods, forefathers, general living entities, relatives, sages, any of those things. One simply resolves all obligations by worshiping the Supreme. So that's kind of, even though that, what's the right word for it? That archetype, or that possibility is showcased by Ramachandra and other versions of the Supreme Lord. In Bhagavad Gita, again, Krishna is saying the same thing, that one does not need to worship demigods separately. And those who do that are called Vedavadarataha. They're attracted by the flowery words of the Vedas, flowery language of the Vedas. So best is just to approach the Supreme. Even if one has material desires and is blunt about material desires, still best to approach the Supreme Krishna, because if we approach the Supreme Krishna, he will not fulfill our material desires in such a way we will become habitually entangled in these material activities. Any other questions? Okay, good. So these are some of the other things that sometimes get put under the umbrella of Hinduism and sometimes not. And I'll talk really briefly. Of course, Buddhism is usually considered its own religion. Although Buddhism did grow out of the Vedic culture, Buddhism does not accept the Vedic literatures, although it accepts many of the same concepts. The concept of reincarnation, the concept of karma, the concept of dharma, the concept of, noble work. So Buddhism accepts those things, although generally Buddhism rejects the Vedas per se. So because it's a religion of India, sometimes it gets classed under Hinduism, although mostly people do not class Buddhism as a type of Hinduism. Jainism is sometimes considered a type of Hinduism, although it's not either. Prabhupada explains in the purports that he writes that Buddhism was what happened when the Brahmanas rebelled against the Vedic culture, and Jainism is what happens when the Kshatriyas rebelled against the Vedic culture. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And of course we have hodgepodgevadis, people who just believe anything and everything. Not any one of these categories, just a little piece from here, a little piece from there. They're not really Vaiṣṇavas or Shakta worshippers or Advaita Vedantas. They kind of believe everything, and they don't follow any one path. And of course there was Ram Mohan Roy, who came up with the Brahmos, which is a syncretic religion which mixes Christianity, Islam, and other things along with into the Vedic tradition. And we have the Prākṛta-Sahajiyās. So these are those people who really brought disrepute to the Vedic tradition by engaging in very gross sex and intoxication activities, so-called on the plea that they were following the Vedic tradition, trying to imitate Krishna, So that's a whole thing in itself. I won't get into that, at least at this point, in great detail. But these people are also sometimes considered Hindus, although they do not in any orthodox way follow the Vedas. Rather, they live a life of self-indulgence, and they use various Vedic formulas and concepts to buttress their self-indulgence. And, I didn't mention here the Aghoris and the Tantrics, but there is a whole wing of what's called Tantra, which in general, in this case, means people who find various kinds of extreme activities, and they use those to gain mystic powers. This is people like the Kapalikas and others who engage in enormous amounts of intoxication, or in ritual sex acts, or they may also engage in various kinds of extreme experiences of the senses, like eating the brains of somebody who is on a funeral pyre, or pushing their body into a place where people have passed stool, or these various kinds of extreme experiences. The idea is that by pushing the consciousness beyond itself through experiencing these extreme things, that one will go beyond the body, which is a very dangerous way of trying to discover or connect with the subtle realm. So most people don't really categorize these as Hinduism, but they do get sometimes lumped in with the same category. So these are things on the fringes of Hinduism, we could say. But as we were talking about a minute ago, the four basic ones are Vaiṣṇavism, Shakta worship, Shaivism, and Advaita Vedanta. Any questions there? So, long time ago, as the Vedic time unfolded, we had the understanding of the Vedas was broken into 6 various categories. So these 6 various categories, the purpose of them was to work together to give a person knowledge of the Vedas and to be able to properly deliver oneself from material life. Now, these 6 things are actually one system. And the original idea of these 6 different categories was to work together to help a person realize that the Supreme was Krishna and that devotional service was the highest thing. So, like we were talking about way back 3 or 4 weeks ago, that philosophy has various parts. So these are the various parts of the philosophy of the Vedas, So it usually starts off with Nyaya, which is logic. So if we're going to understand what the Vedas are saying, we have to understand how to read the Vedas, what the words mean, how to put those words together, and what's a good argument and what's a bad argument based on Vedic explanation. So this was a very detailed process, and it's called Nyaya, or logic. Then the next stage was Vaisheshika, where we come to understand there's something called atoms. And the material world is made of these particles, and these particles come together in various forms, and we become attracted to them through the senses, and that we need to give up that attraction. Then that brings us to the next stage, which is Sankhya, where we begin to understand that human life has various kinds of activities that we need to undergo, and we need to avoid various kinds of sin. And by following various activities, understanding the cycle of reincarnation, understanding the process of bhakti, then we can make progress. Which brings us to the next section, which is yoga, where a person finally realizes that now, through various seating postures and controlling the mind, we become more peaceful. And that leads way to Mimamsa, where we learn the do's and don'ts and the rights and wrongs of engaging in karmic activity, various kinds of good karmas and bad karma. And finally, Brahma Mimamsa is the final stage where we understand Krishna is God, and that all these things just meant to bring us to the path of recognizing that there's a supreme God, we need to serve him, and we do that without wanting any material remuneration. We want to do that without motivation. So these 6 things were part of one system. However, as time developed, they became separate systems in themselves. And each one began to ignore the other parts of it. And so people taught Nyaya as if it was the whole of Vedic knowledge. People taught Vaisheshika as if it was the whole of Vedic knowledge. And all these others, they mostly became very materialistic. Nyaya began to reject the concept of a supreme being. Vaisheshika became very mundane, thinking in terms of only atoms and material life without really understanding what the goal of life is. Sankhya, although it was taught originally by Kapila Dev, was taught again by another person who he was also named Kapila, but he was an atheist, and he taught Sankhya in an atheistic way. And then yoga became its own thing, and people, instead of trying to use yoga to come to the Supreme Lord, they used yoga for mystic powers. And the Mimamsakas, they were taught by a system of engaging in karma where we don't care about God. In other words, we're doing things according to good karma because we don't need to worry whether there's a God or not. If we do good karma, we're going to get happiness. If we do bad karma, we're going to get distress. So there's no need to figure God into the picture. So these became disconnected from the overall system, and they became competitors. And finally, the Mimamsakas won out for the most part. They were the ones who became the most popular. And they taught animal sacrifices. And because animal sacrifices were so gruesome that Lord Buddha came, and Buddha put aside the Vedas. So Buddhism went to battle with the Mimamsakas, and eventually, because of its ahimsa, its teaching of nonviolence, the Vedic system was almost pushed out of India by the Buddhists. It was Emperor Ashoka. We talked about that about 2 or 3 weeks ago, that Emperor Ashoka took the Buddhist philosophy, and because the Mimamsas were so bloodthirsty in their sacrifices, Buddha came to stop that. And so Emperor Ashoka embraced Buddhism, and so the Vedas and all these things were pushed into the background. For the most part, there were still people who followed these various things, these different schools, and they tried to fight with the Buddhists, but it didn't work until Shankaracharya came back in. So now we have these 6 kinds of views of the Vedas, and actually we're in 6, Brahma Mimamsa, because this is the way that the Vedas were taught by Vedavyas. So I bring this out not to just confuse everybody, but just to make people aware that there are these various undercurrents, these various branches of understanding of the Vedas. And if you understand that they exist, then you can understand why we accept one and how it relates to the others. And again, these 6 were supposed to be all one thing, but they began to compete with one another, and they broke off from one another. And then eventually, as time progressed, the Mimamsas, number 5 there, became the most prominent in India. And because of their insistence on animal sacrifices, then Buddhism pushed them out. And then when Buddhism pushed them out, eventually, many centuries later, Shankaracharya came and put the Vedas back into the picture, but he did so in a very Buddhistic way. So he didn't change the Buddhist philosophy completely. He put the Vedas back in the picture, but he taught a Vedic philosophy that was similar to Buddhism. So that's kind of how the overall time flow goes. Questions about that part? Okay, the final thing I want to wrap up with today here is that we have Sampradayas, and these are Vaishnava traditions now. We're not talking about Shaivism anymore. We're not talking about Shakta worship. We're not talking about the 6 Darshans anymore. We're not talking about Advaita Vedanta. We're talking about Vaishnavas, those who understand that there is a supreme, and that supreme being is Krishna. So we have 4 Sampradayas, which were all started by one being in antiquity, like Lord Brahma is the one that starts the Brahma Sampradaya. Lakshmi is the one who starts the Shri Sampradaya. We have Shiva. Now this is not Shaivism, this is Vaiṣṇavism, but it's Vaiṣṇavism as taught by Shiva, who are the Shiva Sampradaya, or the Sampradaya known as how did I refer to it? I can't think of it right now, but the Shiva Sampradaya worships Krishna, but the Sampradaya was started by Lord Shiva, and then finally we have the Kumara Sampradaya. So the 4 Kumaras, they are 4 young looking children, although they're the oldest beings in the universe, and they start a Sampradaya. Now, in more modern times, the Lord Brahma, his Sampradaya was codified and focused by Madhvacharya. The Lakshmi Sampradaya is codified and made prominent by Ramanujacharya. Lord Shiva, in his Sampradaya, is put in the center by Vishnu-swami, and finally the Kumara Sampradaya by Nimbarkacharya. So these are all Vaishnava Sampradayas. So I didn't want to get too deep into that, but I just wanted to make that available so that we can see that the Bhagavad Gita has this kind of overlay, and we'll find that there are people who comment on it from these various different angles. They may be commenting on it from the Lakshmi Sampradaya or the Kumara Sampradaya. They may be commenting upon it from the Brahma Sampradaya. So we are in the Brahma Sampradaya, coming down from Madhvacharya, and that goes to Bhakti-siddhanta, Bhakti-vinod, Bhakti-siddhanta, and A.C. Bhakti-vedanta, and that's where we come from, the Madhvacharya, from the Brahma Sampradaya. And Shiva Sampradaya is also sometimes called the Rudra Sampradaya. And in India today, there are people who are part of these various Sampradayas. You may run into them, and they are bona fide Vaishnava Sampradayas. There's some difference in the teachings, but basically they all recognize that bhakti is the highest, and that service to the Supreme Lord is one, and that one person is Krishna. So that's how they're all the same. Any questions about that? Okay, so then that kind of brings us to the end of our discussion today. So we've been through these various parts. We've talked about history in the Gita. We've talked about the Mahabharata. We talked about that last Wednesday. Today, we kind of talked a little bit about Hinduism, all these various traditions, how they overlay on one another, and how they may have their own things to say about Bhagavad Gita. But we are coming from the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, and Prabhupada is explaining things from a Vaishnava point of view, not from some other point of view. And next week we will talk about some various different interpretations, and then on the 1st of March we will talk a little bit about how Western philosophy views the Bhagavad Gita. So this is future things to come. Any final questions before we wrap up today? All right, so I managed to finish on time for once. So we'll shut this whole business down, and then everybody can go over and have some prasad, and we can talk some more if anyone has.